So a big topic in Salvia psychonaut circles is commonly referred to as the Salvia Archetypes. Returning viewers of this channel already know this by now, but Salvia Archetypes are visions that are very specific and reoccurring in individuals who smoke or use salvia, who have no connection to each other but experience similar things. It's not just that salvia produces similar effects for everyone. It's that the visions that people experience on salvia have a tendency of having similar themes. The Salvia psychonaut community have long noticed this and has been sort of quasi-documenting all these trip reports and have been noticing these themes reoccurring. So in this video, I want to talk about how do we go from our current state of acknowledging Salvia archetypes to potentially making a science out of it. So our current stage right now is mostly anecdotal, where people experience a phenomenon and they just recount it. This is highly susceptible to bias and unclear information. Individual trip reports are pretty weak when it comes to scientific evidence. It is my hope that if we could get a stronger compilation of these reports and start to work toward a harder science. It's really soft right now. it's super soft. As of right now, we're pretty far from having a solid explanation as to what causes archetypes. The closest approximate theory that we have right now that I know of is Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. What it's actually about is that human brains are similar on a vast scale, and so there are mechanisms of survival and just dynamics of living that have tendencies of producing similar symbols and archetypes. A better example is the common myth of being turned to stone in a glance. This is a common archetype from many cultures across the world, and it has to do with petrification, i.e. the fight or flight response. And the expanded concept of fight or flight is freeze and fawn. So then you can see exactly where the archetype of turning into stone from a glance is from petrification. Makes sense to me. So where does the shepherdess or zippers fit into this when it comes to salvia? This is much harder to explain. So we know the main psychoactive chemical of salvia is salvinorin A, and that it's a highly selective kappa opioid agonist, which means it has a high affinity. Sorry, I'm just using all these technicals. It means that it only binds to kappa opioid receptors. It doesn't touch serotonin, mu, delta opioid receptors. It is very specific to the system that it affects in the brain. And I suspect that this may be a large facet of why there are highly specific archetypes when it comes to salvia. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but archetypes are known for any psychedelic drug, and many psychedelics have overlapping archetypes too. But salvia, being a highly atypical substance, has a highly atypical archetypes. Kappa opioid receptors are known for causing dysphoria, and dysphoria creates an uncomfortable feeling. It's a very sensational, tactile experience. So I find it interesting that salvia has a lot of kinesthetic hallucinations, that is, hallucinations of moving and like being pulled, pushed, all that kind of stuff, and visual tactile synesthesia, which means that feeling senses and visions are kind of meshed together in the experience. This often leads to experiences of people feeling like they're being stabbed, pulled, sandblasted, ground into gears, all that good sensory stuff. Which I suspect is why things such as zippers are a prominent archetype, because they pull apart and they're just a very tactile experience. So now that we know all of that, how do we go from taking all these anecdotal salvia experiences and turning it into a science? There's a pyramid of tiers that you have to climb up in terms of becoming a harder science. We're at the bottom tier right now, and so we have the background information. So after we compile all the trip reports that we have right now, the next tier to go up to would be the case-controlled studies. How randomized control studies would work is that you would tell the experimentee, the recipient, the patient, I don't know, it's hard. depends on the context, that they could be smoking salvia or they could be smoking a placebo, and it's 50-50. And that way you can contrast that with the placebo. These people would fill out questionnaires where they would ascribe their experiences. Now these questionnaires have to be like very meticulous in its wording. For example, you can't lay any suggestions. You don't want to come out to somebody who just tripped on salvia and say, did you experience a shepherdess? Did you see zippers? Because that's when you start implanting ideas in people's heads. What we want to do is have randomized control studies and hear the feedback, and then we start looking for the overlap and patterns. Now, since medicinal research is of highest priority in terms of what is being researched, it is unlikely that you'll get a research study specifically focusing on archetypes. But what you can do is that you can document multiple things at once. So for example, if you were to research on maybe salvia alleviates depression or the effects on salvia and anxiety, you could also ask questions about other things. In other words, you can research multiple things at once with these studies. And that's what I would like to see if we're actually going to research further into this highly niche subject, which most people don't give a shit about, let's be real. The next tier to go up to from there would be the filtered information. This is basically the peer review tier. You get people who are more educated and knowledgeable about the specific subjects that you're researching, and you get them to review your process, your findings, and basically validate or invalidate your approach and your findings. This is a really important step because a lot of pseudoscientists will do the unfiltered information section where they do these randomized control trials, but they won't get it peer reviewed. So this information becomes very susceptible to bias, and this would result in highly unreliable evidence. And then after this level, that's when you can start doing the meta-analysis, where you can look at all the data that you pulled in and start making theories based on that evidence, which is a much more solid ground to walk on than I've talked to people on Reddit. Because there are a few problems when it comes to reading trip reports online. One is that people's memories can be unreliable. For example, you don't know when this person wrote this trip report. They could have wrote it immediately after their salvia experience, or they could have wrote it years after their experience, and then therefore would have probably a less reliable memory of what happened. And two is the bias of the writer. Basically what I'm saying is that trip reports can be susceptible to preconceptions of the individual. And then thirdly, somebody might be describing something similar to an archetype that you've heard about, but it's not necessarily that archetype. And I think wheels are a great example of this. Many times people describe the book of life or the wheel, and they describe it very specifically, that it has all these pages and that it's like has to do with your lifeline. However, there are many other reports where they describe spinning or they see spinning objects, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the wheel of life. It just means that they see something spinning. So there's potential pseudo correlations there. So here's my confession time. My salvia trip report that I released a few years ago now, I titled Parade of the Shepherdess. And there are no parades, and there's no shepherdess in my trip. These were archetypes that I read about after I had the trip, and then therefore projected those common themes onto my trip. I was just trying to be poetic with it at the time, but you know, being poetic really devalues the potential for scientific inquiry. If I were to compile a list of trip reports that mention parades or the shepherdess, I might accidentally include that trip report that I wrote, despite the fact that there was no parades or shepherdesses in the trip. A couple of points I want to make before I end off here is that one, I would really like to see a better compilation of archetypes in these trip reports. I know that there's a really strong and loving salvia community out there. I mean, like, salvia is a wild experience. We're curious beings, of course. So if anybody had the time or wanted to create a group, maybe we would get together on Discord or Facebook or something like that, and we would set about trying to hunt down all of these trip reports and compile them into a place that's accessible for everyone. I followed a Facebook page a couple of years ago, and a fellow member of the Salvia community, he had his membership card and everything, compiled all the wheel trip reports that he could find. And it was a great resource, but he just copied and pasted it into the comments on a Facebook post, which is not the most accessible way of accessing these reports. I would like to see like an archive of PDFs or something like that. Another thing we could try is, it would be time consuming, but what you can do is click on each trip report on Arrowhead, go to the trip report, Control or Command F, and look up parade and see if the trip report contains it. And we would have like a key list of words where we could find out what reports mentions these key words. And it gets tricky because when it comes to the Book of Life, that is composed of turning pages, and these pages are often described as tiles, plates. So that's a difficulty in terms of documenting these reports. So something along those lines we could do, but it would be highly time consuming, and like, where the fuck are we gonna find the funding for that? Am I right, guys? So that's all I have for this video. If you made it this far in the video, comment down below the secret code string beanies, and just let everybody know how badass you are. You will not get any reward for commenting, but doing this will earn you my respect. If you haven't already, subscribe and ring that bell. I'm really excited for my next video. It's going to be a bigger project. I've been working on it for a while. I'm expecting that video to come out sometime early next month, provided that I'm not evicted from my apartment because my student loan provider loves to drag their feet. If you want to be like these fine patrons here and support this channel, then go to patreon.com/interbeingart or make a one-time donation at paypal.me/interbeingart. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, trip safe.